Welcome to On the Payroll, my podcast about project management, project delivery, implementing CRM solutions such as Salesforce or Microsoft CE, around leadership, and anything and everything in between. Basically, it's an opportunity for me to riff and talk about topics I'm interested in with some of the fascinating guests that I have. Today I'm talking to Julie Palmer, who's a program manager. And when I talk to another project manager, I really enjoy the conversation because it feels like we're speaking the same language, and I find myself nodding along a lot at the things that she's saying. She's moved from an end user environment, and she also has very extensive consulting experience. I hope you will enjoy this conversation and be able to extract some value out of it in terms of how you can pivot into the Salesforce ecosystem. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy. Hello, Julie. Welcome to my podcast. It's called On the Payroll. How are you doing today?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad to have you on board. You're a project manager, and I think we can both talk about lots of topics that are very fascinating to us both. But why don't we start with you giving us a history or a journey of where you are today and how you got there?
Yeah, sure. As you say, so I'm a project manager within the Salesforce ecosystem and have been for about 10 years now. But I didn't start here or kind of find Salesforce first. So where I've come from, so I was actually educated, and my background is in biochemistry. So I'm a trained biochemist, and that's where I started. And I joined a number of biotech companies working on kind of product development of different types. So one of my first jobs was kind of growing bacteria of E. coli and extracting proteins for testing kits for HIV and HPV, for example. And as I started working on product development, I started becoming part of being the SME and part of project teams. So I was kind of the scientist who was developing the product, testing it, doing kind of trials with the product. And there was an opportunity that came about where the project manager left while we were three-quarters of the way through a project, and they weren't backfilling the PM. So they asked if I would kind of take on the PM side of things because I knew the context and the product well. So I did, and then I realised that this was kind of opening a world to me that I didn't know in my white lab coat in a lab, and I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed stepping out kind of into a different environment. So I kind of ran with that really. I enjoyed it. They enjoyed what I brought and what I delivered. And so I ended up following some of those products through to manufacturing and supply chain and trying to quicken delivery to customers, etc. And then I was asked to PM the change of the CRM. So admittedly, at that moment in time, in that meeting, I had no idea what CRM stood for. And it was a vertical learning curve, I'd say, for the next 6 months, where we were moving from Siebel to Salesforce in June. And so we did a 2-year global rollout of the changes for the different regions for about 1,500 users. And it was about bringing a number of different divisions together into being one life science, which was kind of our vision of the project. And when I finished that, I then moved into a Salesforce Consultancy. And have been fortunate to work and deliver different visions and for different companies and organizations who have used Salesforce for a multitude of business reasons and business directions that they're going in. So I've worked in the private sector, the public sector, and non-profits, and I'm still doing that today.
That's quite fascinating. So you started your journey from an end user point of view, an end client point of view. What were the learnings you took away from that helped you in your role on the other side of the fence as a consulting project manager?
So when I started the Salesforce project with GE, I came from it as a PM, but who had no domain knowledge. And I find that quite interesting because some people are very polar about their opinions about whether or not a PM has to or does not have to know the subject area of what you're delivering. So you could be a textbook PM or not. And I'm quite a nosy PM by nature. So what I found was that I was more comfortable if I knew more. And so like I said, I did have to go through quite a steep learning curve around sales processes, kind of governance around that, the forums, the senior stakeholders that were involved, because my domain before that had been very much in R&D and in kind of product or tech development. So I think what I learned was that I, as a PM, like to know the domain. That's my preferred kind of stance. And I think what I also had the fortunate situation of is the program manager was absolutely superb. So I witnessed her with all the soft skills that I think that I've then taken away from it, which was probably one of my biggest learnings. So it's not a case of I now know how to configure Salesforce. I think my biggest learnings were witnessing her manage a room, being able to bring heads of divisions who are used to being top of their chain, coming together and asking them to be one. So maybe they're not the sole person making the decisions in the future state, and how that works and how you bring that together, how you nurture people on that journey, how you have very difficult conversations, but that's okay. And how you may get things wrong and you need to kind of go back, and how you address that by trying to kind of maybe repair some relationships that have been fraught in the past, but trying to get them to a positive place through the project. So I think people management, stakeholder management, tone of communications, delivering a message, they were probably some of the biggest things I learned going through that 2 years. And also because I mentioned it was a global rollout, there are a lot of cultural differences, right? So we started working with LATAM, then we started working with India, then we started working with the US, and then we were doing Europe. There are 4 very, very, very different cultures separate by themselves, and then also within like regions within some of those as well. And I think I learned to empathize, I learned to listen more than I probably had before. And I think all of that really nurtured and developed, which I needed at the time, developed my communication style and tone as I address and work with others. So I think that's probably my biggest take home from that.
What made you decide to move from, into consulting from what is a science-based background and career?
I think by the time that I had left the lab, I think I'd been in the lab for about 12 years. And so I'd been doing it for a while, and I had worked in a number of different companies. I also traveled during that time and worked abroad in the lab. So I'd seen a lot of different types of product, but I'd always done product development. I'd never worked in kind of manufacturing or QA where you're kind of in a regular testing or regular making cycle. I liked progressing products. I liked testing new things, and sometimes they wouldn't work, but that was still progression, because you're like, that's a no-go. That's not something that we can do here, or the product range or the product use cases, it isn't there. So I was always in that mind frame of what's next. Can we innovate to do this? How can we change it to address something else that maybe something needs? Or maybe a customer comes to us and says, your product's good, but ideally I'd like it to do this. So you're always in this kind of cycle of iteration and development. And I think Salesforce as a domain for me isn't too different for me for that. There's a use case, the product's always developing, you're always kind of moving forward. But I think from the PM side, I think it's more, I just found a groove where I enjoy working with people. We're all kind of working towards a common goal, and projects can be quite intense. And I think you learn the best and worst about yourself, see the best and worst in others, but you keep going forward. And I love that. I think it really kind of validates all the things I love about people. And I think moving from an end user to a consultancy, once the GE project had turned operational, we were in quite a stable state. And I enjoyed as I was showing just before we started, I enjoy that kind of piece of a project where you're learning the most. It's like a really saturation point of knowledge, both from the client about what it is they're looking to do, how they work, the people that you're working with, and how you can kind of get into a rhythm so we get the most out of the project, and we kind of get into a role as soon as possible. And I like to see how different people do different things, both culture within a company, the products that they're using, the problems they're trying to solve. Because I think as a PM, my experience and the knowledge I bring can be, well, actually, I've seen different people doing it in these different types of ways. And I think a consultancy can give you that breadth, both of industry and different types of organizations. And that was the draw. That was a draw for me towards consultancy.
So in your career within consulting, where you're doing projects for end clients, as I say, you know, there are the good, fun projects, and then there are the character building projects. When you are on those character building projects, slightly stressier ones, what are the things that make them memorable to you? Can you draw some themes about what made them more challenging than it should have been?
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to give you an example to start off with, and then I'll talk about the themes. So my first project within the consultancy, I went to a kickoff, which I'd aligned with the project manager, but it was the first time I was meeting face to face the kind of like the sponsor of the project. And I knew that the sales process had been a bit bumpy. But when I came and did the kickoff, I think there was, I don't know, about 15 people or so in the room. We were going through it. It'd been a really good conversation, actually. And at one point I asked a question and he stood up and he just shouted me down in front of the room. And it was very awkward. It was really tense, and you could see nobody knew how to respond. And I'd gone in assuming that everything had been aligned and upfront, because I'd been working with the PM on and off for the last week to make sure that we were tackling everything that we needed to get out in the open in the kickoff. And obviously it was a bit of a curveball. So I kind of addressed him in the room, obviously just to say, we need to work through this together to make sure everyone's on the same page. You may already know this, but you know, this is what I need to do. But obviously inside, your heart's pumping at, 1,000 beats a minute, and it's really uncomfortable. And I feel as comfortable as everyone else's facial expressions are in the room, but you need to kind of you need to be composed. And so I think one of the themes of what I take away from challenging projects and a learning is I'm trying to become, as an analogy, like a swan. So on the surface, I'm coming across and, want to make sure that I articulate myself and is as smooth as possible, but I may be, paddling for my life underneath. So I think people can make it difficult, and I think misalignment of individuals is probably the one thing, or one of the top 5 things that I see as causing challenging times within a project. And that can happen throughout. That can happen because they weren't involved in the bid process. So maybe something was agreed and they didn't feel that they were really part of that decision. And so they're coming to it, they feel like they're coming to it as a bit of a back foot. So you really need to kind of identify that early and bring them back on board. And I feel like there could be functions which are impacted that maybe aren't brought into the party at key points within it. So there's those kind of dependencies where they're not a primary stakeholder, but they are maybe indirectly impacted some way. And it's just being considerate of the people who maybe need to just be informed about what's going on. So it's a classic racy, right? It's a case of, who do I need to inform, who needs to be consulted, who's accountable, and you focus on R and A, but maybe the C and I's aren't always either known, or maybe there's a capacity issue where actually we just can't get to everyone that we need to get to, and so there's just definitely learn that the stakeholder management, mapping, understanding their styles up front can kind of alleviate some of that. So I think misalignment of people is kind of a key one for me. I also think expectations. So customer expectations or client expectations is something that you try to manage as much as possible with a statement of work or a contract. This is in scope, this is out of scope. But, language is super important, right? So you start talking to people about Salesforce language. That's not the language their business uses. That's not what they call their process, the steps that they go through. And I think as you start kind of working through requirements, showing people something in a tool is much more valuable than talking about it. Because if people can see it and you'll be like, oh, so it doesn't do X, Y, and Z, you'll be like, oh, you wanted it to do X, Y, and Z. So I think working models, POCs, kind of, even if it's just quick and dirty, showing them kind of a walkthrough or a click through or something within the tool can really bring to life. And then no one's making assumptions without realizing that they're making assumptions. And so I think customer expectations is something that has to be top of mind consistently through a project. And that again could be those challenging times where maybe you're running with an assumption you aren't aware of. So I've done quite a few trainings of, like, you know, the soft skills of like the unconscious bias, like being aware of your own kind of natural biases as you go into a project and the assumptions that you make. And so, you know, I like to say, there's two things I like to say in a project. One is, I don't agree with the royal we. So if someone says we do it, like, no, who? I need a name, like who's going to do it. And the second one is just like, no, explain that to me in layman terms, and I'll give the answer in layman terms. So not because I think you don't understand or I don't understand, but if we talk about it in a common language, then there's no assumptions surrounding that. So I'd say, yeah, I think people being misaligned and customer expectations are probably the two things. Everything else that comes up, if it's unforeseen or unanticipated, or we know it's a risk and unfortunately it's become an issue, it's already been flagged. But I think it's the people element of expectations and misalignment maybe in comms that can cause the cause extra effort being needed that maybe hasn't been accounted for.
Okay, so just going to put a pin on the RACI you were talking about earlier. We'll circle back to that, as well as stakeholder mapping. You mentioned that you thought that there were top five things that cause projects to fail. You mentioned two. Do you want to flesh out the other three?
Yes. So I mentioned right. Okay. So I think the third one for me is I'm a bit of like, I love a log as a PM, right? So RAID log, which I think I even put on my list here, is probably one of my favorite things of all times, which nobody else would agree with unless you're a PM. And I think it's the documentation of decisions. So the number of times that you've been in a situation where someone's made a call in a meeting and, you know, you circle around the room and everyone said, yes. And then 2 weeks later, you're back either in a playback or maybe something where that decision has led you down a certain path because you've kind of gone off on a tangent and you're now down this other path because of the decision. They don't remember it. There's no documentation of it. And you end up spending a lot of time then having to redo the conversation that maybe took a while to get to, then plus you've now added complexity onto that you then need to unpick again. And I think that can really mushroom, especially in a program where you've got dependent work streams. The knock-on effects can actually be quite severe for a number of different teams. And so I think what you have to have is logging of decisions. So decision making is great, but you need to actually log who, when, and exactly what it was, and make sure that in any kind of like status reporting or something, you play it back. So if you're doing a recap of your status for that week, these are the decisions that were made, these are the ones still to have. And so it does sound quite, people roll their eyes when I talk to them about my RAID log, but it's one of my favorite things because it keeps us all honest, me included. It just keeps everyone honest. So I think decision making and tracking of decision making, I think, can also be a problem. Fourth one, and one of my ones that I have definitely come unstuck with is ambitious scoping. So as a delivery in a consultancy, sometimes you are involved in scoping. Sometimes you get handed the scope, right? So the engagement manager and the salesperson has scoped it out with the client. They've understood it. And part of that initial, before you have a kickoff with the client, you're handed it over and there's like an internal, this is now your responsibility kind of thing. And you take it, and the first thing you do is you look at what they've put in scope and the plan that there's all been agreed. And the first thing is like, are you sure? These two married together, do they? And one of the first things you have to do is go in there and say, I think we need to reassess the plan. But by that point, they've committed resources. They've maybe internally seconded people to kind of make sure there's enough support for things. And so I think there's a point where delivery or someone from delivery has to be involved in scoping. And there has to be a realistic view of best case and worst case. Just as you would do in pricing, right? Best case, worst case, and you meet somewhere in the middle. There has to be something like that on a plan, just because the client, there's repercussions for people on the client side, whether it's not because you're meeting, and hopefully not, but maybe you have a hard stop because that has to be done because they're going to start recruiting for their events, or their event cycle just starts, or because a contract for an existing tool runs out, and so they're expecting you to be able to swap over at a particular point, so you don't leave them kind of empty-handed. Delivery being involved in scope is definitely one thing that I've been burnt, and something that has to be catered for. And you know, from what I've seen, more and more that now happens. I think in previous projects that wasn't always the case. So that would probably be number 4. And my 5th one, I think, is skills. Both sides again, client and consultant, or client and the implementation team. It's, if you have a scope and you know there's a custom build or there's a configuration, we all are in the business of developing people. And I think if you have people in a project who are an architect or a senior consultant who have maybe worked on some products but not others, or want to step up and maybe lead a team of developers, for example, there needs to be a realistic view of what support people need within the role they're taking. And if you don't have the skill sets, call it out. Don't just, it's just not a name in a box, because if you put a name in a box against a particular role, there's an expectation that comes with that title. There's an expectation of what people think people can deliver and how they will operate in that role. And sometimes you come to the table, and on both sides, I've seen it happen on both sides, that's just not the case. And I think you have to be honest about, internally from a consultancy, if you're putting someone in, you know it's a bit of a stretch for them, make sure that in the back end then they've got the support they need, or someone that you're going to pally them up, or, you know, buddy up with, and say, feedback how that's going, you know, can we make iterations, so that you're doing that progression and as well on the client side. And if there are any constraints in any way, just be honest and flag it, because otherwise you end up rolling with something that ends up becoming a pinch point. And the root cause of that tends to be, do you know what, we just didn't have the right person in the right place. Not because that person's done anything wrong, but just because maybe there was an area they weren't strong in, and we should have supported them more, and we should have flagged that to be able to make that happen.
No, I see that happen a lot, actually, especially in consulting, where one of the key metrics that we all are bound to is utilization and billability of the consultants. And when you're doing support work, you're either diluting your day rate, because sometimes you cannot charge everything, the learning curve, for example, or the fact that you've got somebody senior who's got to provide X number of hours to support someone junior that can't be billed to the client. So I think that's one of the tensions that I see in many consulting partners, and the reluctance to provide that support because they are just so focused on the key metric around utilization. And possibly I think that requires a culture shift around this, and not treating consultants like horses. Sometimes horse trading, for example, and maybe that's not the best example.
I know what you mean.
but they're humans as well. You need time to recharge. You need time for training. You need time to support. There's a lot. So this particular topic is quite close to my heart, because I see many consultants get totally burnt out because the customer is putting them on projects after projects after projects, with lip service to training, learning development, to mental health, to all those things that allows us to do what we do best, and not and only rewarding the behaviors around utilization. So things like interviewing, things like recruitment for new teammates, and not focus on that as much. So I've got my personal opinions about how that should be addressed, but I'd like to hear what your thoughts are around this particular topic.
Yeah, so I've been in that environment where, you know, util is king, basically. And there are times where, depending on a role you may have, there is some, you know, util relief of, you know, either a certain amount of hours or a percentage of your expected billable hours per month that you can dedicate to certain activities. And there are tricks to every system if you needed to try and get around that. I've only ever been in that environment. And I don't see how, in the environments that I have been in, how you would change that without a significant shift. And I'm not sure I don't know of a consultancy model that works in any other way. So I'd love to hear, like you just said, you've got your own thoughts. I'd love to hear what they are, because I'm a little bit dumbfounded by it, because I've not seen someone even try to change it. It's just been the way. So util relief and playing the system is the only two ways I have seen that you have some light reprieve.
So I have worked for quite a few partners, a lot in the Microsoft sector and a few in Salesforce when I moved across in 2014. And one of the companies that I was working with, they were very caring about people. And for me as PM, so you identified one of the things that frustrates me as well, where the sales team would set some expectations and sell a project with an estimation that when we as delivery get a hold of you, as you say, are you sure? Because the math doesn't seem to work, the formula doesn't look quite right. What I tend to do is that I would get a realistic estimation of the scope and what have been promised contractually, and then the company would have to give. So I would make my case internally, and luckily in the company that I was at, it was Made Positive, by the way, that's just been acquired, they would actually listen, because they didn't want to lose people, and they would listen, and then I would get what you call util relief. I would get a bunch of write-off days or write-off hours, because it was communication that was miscommunication, or it was our mishandling of the project. So that's one way, and I would take that to everywhere, all the other partners that I would go to. Right now what I'm doing is consulting with them to say, this is something you got to think about. Either you align sales and delivery, have delivery being sales bid process, or have some review of your proposals to make sure that doesn't happen, or you learn from it. You make sure that your guys don't do overtime without putting in the hour, putting in a timesheet, and that gets kind of lost. So that's where I see it. Either the company have to make a change in culture, or people are just going to leave.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I have to say, the last SI that I worked with, it was IBM. They did have a robust way, which we kind of developed as part of the practice, which was that delivery assurance almost before a contract got to you. And obviously, depending on the value or the complexity of the contract, the more checks you would naturally have to have anyway. But I think when you are working with maybe the smaller or the mid-market, sometimes you can go through that contract process without a check. But the practice I was working with IBM were adopting the way that their delivery teams should be operating in, and it definitely made things better. My early days, I think, I learnt the hard way, and then was joyous when I saw it handled in different ways later on. So yeah.
No, I totally agree. Let's circle back to the RACI matrix. I think some people call it RACI, RACI. It's a method of mapping out tasks to the key users and whether they're responsible, accountable, consultative, or informed. Can you tell me what your thoughts are around this? And do you do it for every single project that you're on?
So I admittedly don't do it in every single project I'm on, but it is a great tool, and it is one that I do use where I think there is ambiguity. So I think where things are quite clear cut, or just the size of the project maybe doesn't warrant, it's just not that complex. I tend to use the RACI in conjunction with stakeholder mapping. Actually, it tends to be like a follow-on task for me. The RACI, stakeholder mapping and management, and then the RACI kind of comes afterwards. I really like it. Also because one of the things I mentioned earlier is that I don't like the royal we. So I think with a RACI, it allows me to kind of put out there and say my preferred position is that we have somebody accountable. one person accountable. You may have a number of people that need to contribute or, be consulted, and a number of people that need to be informed, but you are accountable for this piece of work. And so the R and the A for me should be as slim as possible. The C and the I can be as big as possible. And that's why I think it follows nicely on from a stakeholder kind of exercise. But I think, especially where you're talking with projects that you work in that maybe there's parallel programs in a company that you're working for a CRM, but quite commonly a finance project is happening at a very similar time, and there needs to be kind of a link or a dependency between the two, or there's something happening in data, or there's something else happening in another tech project. They're the moments where I think a RACI comes into its own. And I think if you can get people on the same page, it's really powerful. And it just takes away any of the heat. It doesn't have to be a draining exercise. It's a case of, we've got this really key task that we need to make sure we do. Are we all clear about who's doing what? And I think in some of the more complex programs where you have those parallel streams, which are big in their own right, a RACI is a great tool that can kind of canvas across all of them.
So talk through how, so you talked about stakeholder mapping. So talk through how and when you would start putting this together on a project. Yeah.
So I think a stakeholder map for me starts when I start preparing a kickoff. So before maybe I even meet with the PM, I'm taking kind of what I know from the contract and what I know about the client, who's been involved to date. And in that handover that I mentioned that you sometimes, when you get from sales, like you get the hard facts, right? The black and white that's in the contract, but then you need to ask, okay, so how are they to work with? Are they an advocate? Are they doing this because this is their baby and this is something they really believe in? Was it a predecessor and they've now picked it up? You need to kind of figure out those types of kind of maybe some recent history about what brought it to life, and if it was them that brought it to the table or somebody else and they're picking it up. And I think that's really important, because then when you're kicking it off with those people mainly, you need to be on the same page and you understand where they're coming from. Have they got a healthy amount of skepticism? Are they really invested in it, or have they been told that this is something they have to run with? So I think you start quite early on before you kind of meet people in the flesh, and then it's something you just consistently do. And I think as a PM, when you are that conduit between the delivery team and the client, it's one of the things that you have to be most conscious of and most aware of. And ideally what you see people on a journey through the project. So maybe somebody did come in with some healthy skepticism or was quite openly critical about what was being done and how it was being done. And you maybe see them going on a journey, or if you're talking about your communication plans, you already know that is somebody that maybe needs a bit more attention, because you need to make sure that you communicate it in the right way. And then if you're talking to a member of their team or a member of their leadership team, you need to make sure that they are completely briefed, because what you don't want to do is knock them back any further. You want them to be coming towards you. You want to be, not towards you, but you want to be meeting in the middle. If we're starting spot, we need to be kind of working so that at some point we align as best we can to get to the end of it together. And so I think you start right early off with some of those softer kind of questions, and then it's just all of that emotional intelligence, which I think every PM has to have to be able to make it. Because yes, you're delivering hard tech, you're custom building or you're configuring Salesforce, but at the end of the day, you're doing that to enable people, and people then you have to be able to nurture everyone around you. The people that are delivering it, the people who are going to be using it, the people who are giving you inputs into actually how the business requirements and how it needs to work for them to make it, what they're looking for. And so all of that has to start quite early on. And I think a PM, just as they're in their day-to-day, kind of carries that through the project.
So the stakeholder mapping, is that something, so I do that, but I don't actually write it down most of the time. So the RACI is the output that then gets shared, but the stakeholder mapping is not something I document. Do you document?
No, I don't either. I think these are things that I manage through conversations or my own thoughts. And I guess you're right. I guess my stakeholder mapping comes through the output. So it could be the RACI, it could be the communication plan, because even if I'm sending the same message to a number of teams, maybe the channel I use, the frequency, or who prepares it and sends it, because even that can be quite sensitive if it's coming from the right person. they're the things that I guess are the outputs of my stakeholder mapping.
That just brought something up to mind, because I was speaking to another project manager where she had to take on someone else's project, and she was handed a mapping that just didn't look quite right. So I was reflecting, and I was just thinking, I don't formally create that document of the advocate and who to move where, but as you say, I do it mentally, and it comes out in how I actually execute my project. So just following on from that, if you found out you had to come off project for whatever reason, and that you had to hand it over to somebody else, what are the artifacts do you already have? That, so for example, the status report would give a highlight of the journey.
Yeah.
What other artifacts would you already have on hand that would give an idea of the project? And what else would you think you would have to supplement that to be able to hand over?
Yeah, okay. So I think you're right. Like status reports, I really like Jira. So, in terms of actual delivery, right?
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. So in terms of where things are at, I think Jira status reports are great. I think and maybe I should take this from your friend, by the way, if she shared you a template, but it's the softer things. It's the softer side of things, of how I communicate and how I work with people, that is probably the thing that I need to share more of. And that could be not just with the client, but also people within our team. That could be a case of, so again, outside of like holiday plans or movement logs and things like that, could be a case of, we're coming up to this piece of work, this is a stretch. Going back to what we said about skill sets, actually, I know this is a stretch for this particular person. So just make sure the SA is kind of on hand a bit more to kind of support this little piece of work, or this particular sprint is super crucial. You wouldn't know that from the things I've told you, but it is super crucial because of this. So I think outside of my RAID log and all of those hard things, it's the soft bits that I don't document, and it's the things that I just know about people that I don't write down. They're conversations that I have, so I know about the people I work with, but they're the things that would be most helpful, and it's the things that I would appreciate, because they're the questions that I would ask as a PM. You can see how often I speak to people from my calendar, and I can add you to how frequent that is. But you don't necessarily know if they're quite passive about the project, or to work with them you really need to push them to do X, Y, and Z, or they're the things you need to know as a PM, because that's what you need to focus your time on. And that is admittedly what I do not write down.
Okay, so let's flip it now. You being asked to take on a project, the PM's left suddenly, zero documentation, apart from the status reports and whatever they've got. Possibly, I took up a project with zero entries in the RAID log, and that was, yes, it was one of those recovering projects.
Okay.
No fun. And what would you do, and how would you go about? Okay, so let's say the first person you're speaking to is the account exec, the guy who sold the project. Yeah. What are the kind of questions you might have for her or him?
Okay, covering project, I don't have much documentation, AE. Okay, so I'd probably ask the history of the sale, of who he spoke to and what he knows, and if he's still involved, because some AEs stay involved in projects and some people don't. So I'd probably see if he or she knew much about the current status of it, if they're still in contact, because they may be trying to upsell into the account, if they kind of know that type of information, or if there are any red flags they already know before I start talking to the client. I'd probably start that with the AE. Depending on what they say and what they know, maybe go into details, but that's probably what I would say. I'd like a bit of history. I'd like to know what he knows about what they're trying to achieve. If they're still involved, if there's any red flags, I need to know. That's probably what I'd ask an AE. And then let's imagining I'm meeting with the PM for the first time on the client side, then I do admittedly, I go in saying I've read some documentation about what it is you're trying to achieve, etc. But can you please treat me like you're onboarding me onto the project? What is it that I need to know? And then I try to take it from there, about how open they are with me, how, how much kind of marries up to what I've already read, and then just take the questions from there and kind of say, oh, actually, would you say that was a bit of a risk, actually? Oh, if you do you log those somewhere? Is this joint trade log that we've got? And then I would just start populating it as part of a conversation that we're having, introducing the words if maybe the risks or the issues aren't kind of there. And then just ask to say, right, so I'm new today, right? This is my first week. So I understand X, Y, and Z need to be done. Is there anything else I'm missing? And then I ask them to basically fill in the blanks. And then from then on, you can run it as your own. I think the first couple of days when you take on a project with nothing, I can imagine is quite fraught, and people are maybe assuming you to know more than you do actually know. I'm not admittedly good in those conversations. I'll get past as best as kind of the next person. I'd rather be honest about what I know and I don't know, because I want to build my own credibility. And I don't think I can build that by pretending something I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you do it?
I would add by talking to all the team members and getting
yes, of course,
a really good soft feel of where things are, because generally on projects like that there's level of friction, which then we need to try and tread really, really carefully, because there'll be some history that no one else knows, for example, why the PM left. And so those are the fun ones. But that was a really good segue into that. So let me ask you then, I think being in a consulting partner is interesting, because you're not the only project manager. There'll be others, and your team will have worked with other PMs who will have different styles to you.
Mm-hmm.
What is your opinion on the role of a project manager in a consulting partner?
Okay, so you're absolutely right. I have been in that situation, of course, where you're working with people who have worked with other people. I think a project manager, like the role is the same, right? The role is you are responsible for delivering a project against a contract, and you've got the constraints of the budget, scope, and time, and you need to kind of manage within that. Styles wise, what I like about working with consultancies, and this doesn't go for just PMs, it goes for all roles, is that everybody should have their own style, because we're all individual people. And I think that's what brings character and flair and individuality to the people that we work with. I think the main things are that you have a common methodology that you follow, and that your quality and outputs are consistent. I think how you get there has to be that level of flexibility to provide everybody, including a PM. Everyone, I mentioned earlier around, are you a PM that has domain knowledge? Are you not? The practices that I've worked in, we've all had domain knowledge. So we've all come with Salesforce, like varying Salesforce backgrounds, but varying Salesforce kind of knowledge, which I think has always helped. And it kind of gives you credibility within your own team, which I think is like the trust that you need to bring, the trust you need to build. One, because, I'm assuming they know their stuff. They should have the same kind of assumptions for me. And also, if someone tells you it's going to take them 3 days to configure 2 objects, I might then question and say, really? Is it really going to take you 3 days to do that? So we need to kind of get on the same page of kind of expectations of pace, what they know, etc. And I think you bring that when you have Salesforce like domain knowledge. I think with the different styles, I think with a kickoff, I mentioned the kickoff earlier with the client, one of the most important things is the kickoff internally. It should be an open, transparent space where it's okay, so this is me, this is how I like to do things, etc. And you find, as a project team, your groove. You're like, this is how I like to work, this is how I like to work. Has anyone got any kind of like lines that you don't cross, like working hours and this, that, and just an appreciation of outside of this project, someone has a life, and therefore that means that they don't start until 9:30, or they have to go by 4:00, and there's an understanding. And I think as long as a PM can do that, then outside of the hard skills of delivering a project, that is what a project manager should do. You should be nurturing an environment within a project team that is performing. And you have to go through some steps to get there. But how a PM does that, I think their style and the reason they are successful in delivering their projects gets them there.
Thank you, Julie. I think we've covered a huge amount today, and there's a lot more we can talk about. And we have discussed that these would be probably a series of podcast recordings that we can deep dive into more of the other topics. So one of which is quite close to my heart is team storming, norming, performing bit, which we will do the next time. So before I wrap this up, let me just ask you one question, and I'll do that every session as well, about yourself in terms of what do you think are your quirks or your eccentricities?
Okay. I'm now trying to think about things that people have said to me or fed back to me about working with me. So I have been told in the past that I can behave a little bit like my hair colour. So I'm a redhead, and I see PMs who are consistently calm and really, really, what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe consistent is the right word. Just consistent in their approach, the whole, like the way they deliver, their tone of voice, etc., etc. I am more emotive than that, and I show it if I am. I show when I'm frustrated, but I also show when I am, enjoying and kind of excited about what it is we're doing, which is 95% of the time. But I don't shy away if that something isn't going the way that someone has told me, or they've committed something to me, haven't flagged me. So one of my things is I don't like surprises. And it's in the kickoff in my internal team, I will say a couple of things, and one of them will be, I don't like surprises. If you tell me that if say on Friday we've got a delivery or a due date, don't come to me on Thursday evening and tell me we're not going to meet it. You won't get a good reception. If you tell me 2 weeks ahead of time, you need some more time, or something unexpected has come up, I will back you to the hills. I will absolutely back you to the hills. But don't tell me 12 hours beforehand you're not going to make it. We've got no leg to stand on. And I don't expect you to do that for me. You're a responsible person. I'm a responsible person. If I can't do something, I would flag it as well. So I think that's probably one of the things that people have said to me is different to the way that they work with me. And I will also I'm also extremely honest. If I'm having a bad day, if I'm not maybe having and I keep picking negatives, but only because I want to show that people can bring themselves to work. I might come to a stand up and say, I've had a really bad morning. If I snap at you today, it's nothing to do with you. I won't hide the fact that I've had a bad day, because people have that, maybe a different persona at work than they do at home. I personally find that quite exhausting. And so it will be me being me. So if I've had a bad day and I'm a bit snappy, I can't pretend that I've not had a bad day and pretend that everything's okay. I'm just not very good at it. And so I like to put it out there and say, guys, it's not a great day for me. Do what you need to do. But if I'm not super chatty today, you haven't pissed me off, don't worry about it. And I guess that's probably the other thing that maybe is a bit different. Other people I work with are a bit more, they can, it's under the hood and they're fine. Whereas I'm maybe a little bit more expressive about it.
I think we're very much alike on that particular point, because I think it makes it so much easier to manage when everyone knows where we're coming from, and we may be slightly under the weather, not quite as chatty or whatever. Also, I like your expectations. No drama is my mantra. No drama, no surprises. So tell me ahead of time, or if there's something you think that you need to communicate to the client that's not going to be given a happy reception, then I need to know so I can help them manage that as well. I don't want to know after the fact. So
exactly. Yeah.
Yes. So thank you so much for spending the time with me, Julie, and recording this. You've had provided a lot of information around project management, especially around the consulting sector, which we both live in. So thank you very much, and we'll see you again in a future podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks, Pei.
Thank you.